Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. It's still blackout week here on the podcast. And so my third guest for over the last few days to talk about the blackouts is my friend, longtime friend, J. Paul Oxer. J. Paul, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Hey, Robert, good to be here.
So I met J. Paul 20 some odd years ago when I was working on my first book on Enron called Pipe Dreams. And J. Paul, I could give you a long intro, but if you don't mind, if our custom on this podcast where we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics is to have the guests introduce themselves. So if you have 30 or 45 seconds, you've just arrived at a dinner party, tell us who you are, please.
An independent contract consultant or power developer, got a background in engineering, lots of experience in international project development and finance. Know my way around utility projects, power projects, renewables, water utilities. Most of the time in the last 20 years, I tell everybody I've spent those last 20 years getting kicked over a cliff and being expected to learn how to fly on the way down.
So you've been in this sector for 40 years?
Yeah, 40 plus.
40 plus years. Okay.
That's it. 40's enough to give, that gives you some chops in this. So.
Okay, good. So now, to be clear, one of the things we didn't discuss was, when I have an author on, I say, well, what's the call to action? You're not selling anything. You don't have a book out. You're not.
Don't have a book to sell. Don't have any, I'm just a simple cowboy and off the trail trying to make a day's wages.
Well, let's jump in. So thanks for that introduction. And I'll start with one of the questions I've asked a couple of other guests we've had during Blackout Week. Why are we seeing more blackouts and potentially catastrophic ones like we saw here in Texas, but really in Texas and California? Texas kind of was gleeful last summer about seeing the Texas politicians, including Ted Cruz, the Republican from Cancun, making fun of California over their blackouts. And now there's some humble pie being eaten here. Why are we seeing blackouts in Texas and California?
Well, I mean, and my guess is that, just looking at this from a systems consultant, it doesn't have to be electric systems, but electric system, any sort of structural system like that. When you put a certain amount of, when we started the renewables, the renewables have been going along here for, years and years and years. We had wind power 50 years ago. We didn't have a lot of it, and we didn't have it connected to the grid much, but we did have it. So as it becomes a larger and larger percentage of the total operating fleet. So as an example, when we have an RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard here in Texas, which was intended to make renewables, mostly wind at the time when we were thinking about it, but now solar, since it's become so much more cost efficient. We had the goal was to have 15% of the renewable or of the generation fleet to be from renewables. And so as you move from, a negligible percentage up into a larger and larger percentage of the generating fleet that's made up of renewables because of what's called intermittency, renewables have this characteristic, particularly wind and solar, not geothermal, which I happen to know a lot about, but wind and solar particularly are intermittent, which means you can't tell them to come when you need them. You have to catch them when they're coming by. Okay, you can't call it out. You can't dispatch it. You can't ask for it. You absolutely have to capture it when it's available. Because what we're really doing with the renewables is harvesting energy. We're not generating energy. And so that energy is just.
That's a great, I thought about this a long time. I've written a couple things. Harvesting energy instead of generating it. That's a really interesting, and you can't harvest all the time.
Correct. Well, you can only harvest at harvest time. As it turns out, harvest time for the sun, for solar energy, sun's got to be up. Harvest time for the wind's got to be blowing. And so and on anything that's fuel based, that's differentiated from geothermal, which has its own issues associated, which we can compare to later if you like. But on anything that's fuel-based, like coal or natural gas, carbon-based fuels, even biomass, okay, what you do is you convert that energy from stored potential in the fuel to functional in the electrons that it pushes out, versus simply harvesting it when it comes by on a wind farm. So if you compare the latest blackout. There was something that caused the blackout. Okay, something that caused the wind turbines to stop, and they stopped for whatever reasons. You can get into the politics and who and why, but the wind turbines stopped. If you remember, was it 7 or 8 years ago in 2014, I think, there was the quote, the great still out in West Texas. In the middle of August, we got the highest demand possible because Texas is a cooling environment. Okay, it means we use more air conditioning than we do heat typically. Even though we use a lot of heat for electric heating during the last week, typically temperatures are more moderate during the wintertime. And so we're a cooling environment, which means you spend more of the energy to bring the temperature down than you do to bring it back up. Okay, so in a current or a condition like that, you'll have all that wind out in West Texas, for which those CREZ lines, or competitive renewable energy zone transmission lines, were built to be able to move that wind energy that was harvested there and move it into the load centers: San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, Houston, and in as many places as needed along those trail lines. And so when it stops, if you've got, say, 10%, some say back then, say 10% of your energy, and energy, not just power, but energy, the kilowatt hours are coming from that wind, and everything else is running full speed because you're at maximum demand. When that stops, that means everything else, the other 90%, has got to go up by 11%, which is the extra 10 over the 90, to be able to make up for the 10 that got lost. So you can't harvest it. You have to take it when it's available. So even in cooler, more pleasant periods, when you don't have that high demand, if there's energy coming by, or the energy coming by in the wind, the ERCOT tends to dispatch that first, or capture that, call that, toll that first, rather than tolling the fuel, because the fuel can be saved.
Well, and that's one of the things that's been, in fact, on the briefing on Wednesday that Bill Magnus, the CEO and president of ERCOT, gave. He talked about that requirement for ERCOT to be continually monitoring and doing all of this forecasting and everything else to accommodate the variability of wind and solar,
right?
Which I thought was interesting, because I'd heard him talk about some of these issues before, but it seems like it's front of mind. Well, so
and for anybody that's operating any of it's called the ISOs, the independent system operators, which ERCOT is ours. Okay, and then you have the Western grid, the Eastern grid, and then not connected, but on the edges of us to the east of us is MISO. Okay, mid-continent, and north of us is a Southern Power Pool, just west of us, and which El Paso is connected, is the WEC, West Energy. Let's see, the interconnect. Okay. Anyway, all of those are independent system operators. Okay, and the larger the percentage of the total generation capacity within those systems that the renewables represent, the more closely they have to watch out for it, because the reserve or the margin capacity that is not, it's not a reserve margin in terms of operating. It's just that some of the turbines, some of the power plants, you can over rev them, if you know what I mean. Okay, so if they're running, it's like a 500 megawatt coal plant, you can run it maybe to 510. Nuclear plant, you can run them up, maybe 7, 6, 8%. And so as an example, when the big still happened those years, 8 or so years ago, ERCOT goes out and just sends up a flag and says, send us everything you got. And so everybody was running overtime, trying to meet that demand. And even then they had to have rolling blackouts to shed some of the load, because if you have more load or more demand than you have supply, ultimately you have to balance those two. And it's not like balance those two, day to day. It's like minute to minute. And That's what ERCOT does. Sure. And if you don't do that, there are really bad things that happen to the system. And while I'm, with respect to the recent blackout, what happened was the event was a cold event that stopped, the generation goes down and snapped off. There were 185 power plants that tripped off in a matter of a couple of hours. Well, you can't recover all that because they're freezing. So now you've got to get them back on. But if you don't shed the load that goes with it, it's called a frequency imbalance. Right. And ultimately that frequency imbalance will damage the entire transmission and substations, interconnect transformers. And if you think it was going to be a week for us to get back up after what happened in the coal, if that had happened in that frequency imbalance and had a major fault for ERCOT not doing, it would probably be May before we were back up and running again.
Well, let me follow up on that, because that is one of the things that I've been thinking about quite a lot, and started writing a piece I haven't quite published yet, but that Magnus said during the board meeting, that what was called the urgent board meeting on Wednesday, he said it would be weeks. And and talking with other people about the difficulty of going from black, the grid blackout, complete 26 million Texans without power, that the ability to restart the system, or as my friend Peter Grossman said, this is a system that was never meant to be turned off. And
correct.
So getting it started again. And you're saying you think it could be 2 or 3 months, and the knock-on effect.
Well, not just, I mean, starting back up, it would, if there had been if it goes down and just starting it back, it has to be started up, and you can't start it up in pieces, and, you have to start it up, and you have to start the one next to it to have the frequency balance for each one of those, so they match frequencies. Okay. Now, I'm not going to tell you that I'm an electrical engineer. That's for somebody far more educated in that sector than me. But I do know that going off frequency is one of those things that, from electrical system standpoint, don't do that. And so
Magnus made a key point of saying they were down to 59.3, and that below
correct.
that, and they were there in another 4 minutes, that they would have had a cascading loss of generation.
Correct.
And
not just a cascading loss of generation, but cascading loss of generation because it damaged the power plant.
Yeah, and I've heard conflicting things about some of those plants would shut off themselves before they damage, but nevertheless, there was also one thing that came out of the hearing yesterday in the Texas House hearing on this, was that the head of Vistra said that the Comanche Peak plant, the other big nuclear plant up in Glen Rose, it was 3 minutes away from tripping off.
Right. So, well, and what they have, each of those power plants, because of this, they have what's called a voltage and frequency limiter. So if they're pushing in, or they're delivering into a system where, and they're running at a 60 hertz frequency, and the voltage goes down, the frequency goes down to 59.3. Normally they'll trip off. I'm doing some work up in PJM, and it'll trip off at 59.7. So if all these, this is pure speculation. I'll admit this, it's pure speculation. But what happened is when they dropped all this load, and a couple of these came off, then the cascade occurred because the frequency dropped, so it started tripping all those plants off because of the frequency, the voltage and frequency limiter tripped them off. And then because it was so cold, it took a while to get them back on, and they probably froze. Like, there's one report that one of the coal plants, the coal pile just froze solid.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you can't shovel all the coal in, and got to keep it rolling,
Right.
So, and what happens in much of the natural gas network that we have, irrespective of where it is and how much it is, most of the compressor stations, as a consequence of a FERC interest some 20 years ago, to minimize the emissions that were occurring from combustion-based engines that were running the compressors at the time, they changed those compressors, the compressor engines, over to electric compressors. So when the electricity goes down, the gas goes down, and then you can't get gas to the natural gas plants. So when they have they're fuel starved or voltage starved, or the frequency goes down, there are any number of things that will trip them off. And then you have to load all this back up.
Right. And when you say that, I've been thinking about these issues for a long time, but the electric, it reinforces the centrality of the grid to everything that
absolutely correct.
And the power system itself is dependent on the grid, right? Which seems kind of silly even to say, but to move that gas, to pump the crude. Well, I'll ask the question. So, because I've been thinking about this, and if Texas had gone dark, if the blackout had occurred and ERCOT goes black, what would have been the ripple effects throughout the rest of the U.S. economy, just looking at, say, energy and transportation?
Well, I mean, from the electric standpoint, there's a whole bunch of The gas going out, most of that is compressed, like when we ship gas off from the Henry hub and move it through there, it goes up to the gas pipelines and that sort of thing.
The
Okay.
interstate lines that are
Interstate
going,
lines, they go out
mainly east and north, right? And
yeah, because those were the gas load centers are. Everybody needed gas, and then they found the Marcellus Shale. They found so much gas up there. It's like Rich Kinder was building. I forget the name of the pipeline, but it was like one of the express pipelines. They wound up having this, one of the express pipe, and so he wound up going in and redoing it to run the valves the other direction, so that it pumps it south. Because suddenly there's so much gas up there, he puts it into the Midwest to move it towards Chicago. But one of the things that would have happened, even though there is most of the power that runs the refineries is grid based, they all have reserve power. Okay. It's like the wastewater treatment plants, the water plants and wastewater treatment plants. For the most part, they have, some time ago, they have standby systems, but the whole point is to keep them from being like a wastewater treatment system. You don't want it fouling or failing, then untreated sewage going into its discharge. Okay. So they have diesel based reserve generators that every once in a while you just fire those up just to keep them going anyway.
Sure.
And I can tell you a story about that on managing a demand charge in a demand charge or power and energy environment. So that demand charge is in demand project or demand tariffs is set in 2 15-minute increments. So if those the highest 2 15-minute increments total together, that would be the percentage, that would be the demand that the power company had to meet for you. So they would charge you as a percentage of their total generation fleet. Okay. So you were paying for a chunk of but we don't have that in Texas. And so when it comes down to it, what we have here is an energy-based, non-capacity-based tariff system.
Right.
Okay.
And how much of that is to blame for all of this?
Well, when you get back down to it, some of the issues that cause these plants to be tripped off could have been solved or addressed, or because while this is one of those things that happens every once in a while, it still happens every once in a while. It's not like this was the first time this ever happened.
Right.
And as it turns out, if you're looking at black swans, if you really take last week into account, we had 2 black swans fly in back to back, one after the other. Because the first one
what were those?
There were 2 separate storms that came in.
Okay.
Okay. So as it turns out, it was the 2 storms. So if you, like in my house, it got down to 16 Monday morning, it was 14 Tuesday morning, and came up Wednesday and it was 32. And then by Thursday night, it dropped down to 21 again. And that was the second storm coming through. As I say, everybody who thinks a black swan is an event that doesn't happen, it doesn't occur very often. If you're into risk management and dealing with emergencies like this, my assumption is that black swans fly in flocks.
and ERCOT just wasn't written. And is it?
Well, ready? It wasn't necessarily ERCOT. Okay. So if you think in one of the senators was beating up ERCOT yesterday, rightly so, but they were trying to say who exactly is responsible. Well, there are a lot of responsibilities for this. Okay. Some of the wind turbines, the wind turbines weren't the ones that were totally responsible for this. Neither was the gas, neither was the turbines, or neither were the compressors, neither were any of these. It was the whole system is not built for an extraordinarily cold event like this. But the problem is that's a risk management approach. Okay. And risk, while we're looking at risk, what is the risk if it gets cold? Well, if it gets cold, the probability of it getting cold is such and such. You can look at that statistically. But the issue on risk is not the probability of occurrence; it's the probability of occurrence times the coincidence or the whatever occurs, the magnitude of the occurrence. Okay.
So it's the possibility of bad things happening, and then multiplying the cost of that bad thing. Right?
Yeah,
you don't need insurance against a scrape. You need an insurance against a head injury. Or
yeah, I mean, when I talk to folks about risk management, you have insurance. Well, yeah. I said, well, why? Well, in case something happens. Okay. So like what? Well, like the worst thing you can imagine happening. Okay, if it happens, that what's the outcome of that? If it's the worst, if it's the very low probability. So if in environmental risk management, which I did spend a lot of time in, risk was the probability versus the toxicity. Okay, so the toxicity is what, think of it as the probability of occurrence versus toxicity. Okay, so what if it's a 10%, the 10% chance that you're going to drink too much water? Well, too much water is not that bad for you. But what if you have a 0.111 thousandth of a percent times drinking cyanide,
right,
or arsenic? Okay, different impact, could be the same risk on a different probability it occurred. So what we looked at, what appears to have happened on several fronts, was they didn't heat the turbines. They're not built for cold weather here.
right.
Or they weren't weatherized. The wind farms, wind farms operate fine in cold weather. Look at Michigan, look at Iowa, look at Pennsylvania. Okay, they run fine. It costs a little more to equip them for the weatherization.
But wasn't it true though that some of them were coated with ice? And
Correct.
I grew up in Oklahoma, and you can weatherize something all you like, but if it's covered in ice, it ain't going nowhere.
Well, and that's true. And as it turns out, that's right. It will turn in this particular case. If you compare the difference in, say, the ice in Iowa versus the ice that we were getting last week, okay, because it wasn't just a cold front that came through; it was an ice storm.
Right.
Okay, so rather than getting this smooth sheet of ice along these turbine blades, which have had little to no effect on the aerodynamic effect of the blade itself, what happened was it froze over, and it got something that looked like cottage cheese that had been smeared on it, which completely disrupts the aerodynamics, and that knocks out the performance of the blades by about 80%. And that's, once they get to a certain point, they stop. If they go down at 70%, or around 70%, if it gets down and you slowed them 80%, they'll lock in and stop.
And you've worked on project development with wind projects, have you not?
Yeah, I helped get the permits for the Milford Wind Corridor project in southwest Utah, which was it's 300 megawatts. It was the first new project put on BLM property in 20 years. It was the first one that was permitted under the Argonne National Laboratory programmatic EIS for wind, and it was the first one on new BLM, or first new project on BLM property. And
So
in 20 years.
Are you agnostic then on how you develop projects, on what types of power power projects you develop? It sounds like you've done different kinds.
I've done energy efficiency projects, wind power projects, gas-fired projects. I'm working on a couple of gas-fired projects up in Pennsylvania. I've done small coal-fired projects. I've done a couple of boiler projects, and worked on a sugarcane by gas. The BAGASSE, the refuse that's left after they crush the cane for syrup down in Florida. And I didn't work on a nuke plant. I observed one and did a lot of research on it. But yeah,
you've done a few.
Yeah.
So is transmission, is that the biggest issue now? I saw a report that ERCOT did just 2 months ago talking about the difficulty of transmission getting to some of these projects that are waiting in the queue. Is that one of the biggest hurdles in facing transmission, or facing large scale deployment of renewables?
Well, no, I mean, I think it's fair to say we have large scale deployment of renewables now here in Texas, because it's, fully 15% of the fleet is renewable. So it's mostly wind to start, and then because of the price drop in solar, I mean, it costs less now to produce solar than it does to produce conventional gas fired in most cases when it's going.
Right.
The problem continues to be that the quote intermittency, which means that it's only intermittently available. Right. Okay, we're back to this dispatch area.
Harvested, not generated.
Right. Okay. And so if you think, and one of the ways I tried to explain this to somebody was graphically. If you look at a graph of solar power, okay, over here there's a diurnal curve to it. It goes up and then goes down like this. So when the sun comes, it's dark, there's no solar power. Sun comes up, sun is hitting the solar power module at an angle, And the higher it gets during the day, the more power it gets because it's more direct. And then it goes back down, goes to the other side, and it stops overnight and does the same thing next morning. Very predictable, okay, in terms of the power output and the energy that's generated. And what you can think of under that curve, the power output is the height of that curve, and the energy is the area under it. Okay. So what happens for solar particularly, it is particularly susceptible to cloud cover, obviously, because that intercepts this. So if you have a big cloud, you got a big, huge, say you got 100 megawatt solar power field is running at full tilt, middle of the day. A cloud comes over and goes before it and the sun. It goes from the top of that curve and slams straight to the bottom and stays right there until the cloud comes off or gets out of the way. And then all of a sudden it goes straight back up. So what you have is a variation in the voltage and the voltage and the amperage that are coming off of that power, and the reactive power that has to be there to back up the system when it drops so suddenly. So it's the reactive power, not the transmission, that tends to be the problem for solar.
Gotcha. Okay. So,
or at least it's been my experience.
Right. So I want to shift gears here because we met when I was working on pipe dreams, and I've forgotten now how we got acquainted, but anyway, it was a long time ago.
Well, I can tell you who introduced us, but we'll talk about that over some adult beverages one afternoon.
There you go. So there's a lot of focus on deregulation and whether the whole push for deregulation on the electric market was a good one. You worked at Enron for a long time. How long were you there, and what was Enron's impact on Texas, not just Texas, but on the deregulatory effort broadly in the United States, including natural gas?
The deregulatory effort started with natural gas because natural gas was essentially bottled up. Okay. And Ken Lay, God bless his fast on soul, was having worked at the Department of Energy, looked at an economic study saying there would be more value you can extract from that natural gas in an open market. It would also open up innovation to look at new ways to use it, make it available to other customers. It wouldn't be controlled by the feds to say, okay, you can only get so much at this price. So, we don't work in a planned economy. Okay. So what that did,
and this was happening. The Power Plant Industrial Fuel Use Act, if memory serves, it was passed in 1978, something like that.
Yeah. I mean, the concept was going on in the 70s. I think,
prohibited much interstate movement of gas.
Right.
And so what happened during the Reagan years was with Lay was part of this, but it was this push for deregulation of the gas market so that their entrants could come in and that there'd be more interstate commerce with gas, but also more production. Is that fair?
Correct. And I think the evidence of that is once there was, an opportunity, an incentive to go search for gas. I mean, think about that. When George Mitchell developed the horizontal directional drilling to the point, explored and experimented with that he was looking for gas. Right. Okay. And that ultimately led to the fracking boom, which led to us having a surplus of gas. That's why the Marcellus Shale, that's why we know so much about it. Between that and the Utica Shale,
the Barnett, and
the Barnett and all the Haynesville and the Gravel Wash, all the ones down here in Texas, but also the Utica Shale that underlies the Marcellus Shale. Right. But it's fair to say that pursuing that made that gas available, made that as an energy source. Which if you harken back to the 70s, I remember doing energy efficiency conferences, speaking at on a series of them I was doing for the governor's office and for Governor Busby in Georgia, speaking on energy efficiency and how to reduce your energy use, be more efficient with the way you use it. Well, one of the things that this did was increase the amount of energy that was available, and not just in oil, but looking at natural gas, because natural gas had applications in the gas turbine business, coming from the aviation fleet, where those fuels, you could take those turbines, which they did, all these aviation derivatives, aeroderivatives they call them, and turn those into power plants. Okay, so you could use those for power plants, and so it became much more cost efficient. Or cost effective. It didn't have the emissions. It didn't have the materials management problems.
Right.
In a coal-fired plant, most of the staff, most of the population, most of the labor that you have in a coal-fired plant is going to be involved with moving the coal into the plant, burning it, shoveling the ash out, and doing something with that. You know, it doesn't take but a handful of guys to move.
A big fleet of people that you need to move stuff where you don't with gas. You just
with gas, you just plug in the pipe, you know, and it goes straight in, just pressurized. So, I mean, that changed the logistics, changed the operating mechanics. They'll spin up a little faster, you know. And they've developed since then. They've developed so they have flex plants, which have a lot more capability to load follow, as they call it, without losing heat efficiency.
So let me toss in one quick fact. When Enron failed, the year it failed, 2001.
December 3rd, 2001, a day that will live in infamy here in Houston, certainly.
And I was standing outside the Enron building that morning.
I was standing in it that morning. So
when Enron failed in 2001, the U.S. was burning about 5 trillion cubic feet a year of gas in the power sector. Now we're easily over 11, more than doubled in 20 years.
Right.
But that deregulatory push of Enron also was, it was a very powerful company, politically powerful, politically influential, and they were pushing deregulation, but they were also part of what was their play? How did Enron affect the wind industry in Texas?
Enron had a group, Enron Wind, that was based out in Tehachapi, California, and they were developing projects, looking at them all over the place. And then ultimately, with the sort of details of how to get there, they wound up with GE turbines, and then owned some projects out in West Texas. Then ultimately, they traded those so that those GE projects, and then later on Enron projects, if I recall correctly, wound up going to FP&L, which is now named NextEra. I'm sorry, NextEra.
NextEra.
Right,
Energy,
next decade's an LNG project I'm working on, or have worked at. So
Enron Wind became GE Wind. The GE bought Enron's turbine business, and then some of Enron's portfolio of projects became one of the bases of NextEra's footprint.
Yeah, so there's, I mean, the provenance, the history, the history of all of this, where these pieces come from. You know, the wind business is pretty big, but even so, there were some key players in it, and it was known for, in my estimation, you know, when one of the criticisms that I had of Enron that you and I talked about 20 years ago now.
Yeah.
You know, Enron had the history of their approach was to make the deal. Okay, they didn't necessarily make the deal work. Okay, so
but the deal makers got rewarded for making deals.
Deal makers got rewarded, and there's
implementing the order sheets or
right, because they got paid. You know, they got paid on as a percentage of the NPV on the deal when it got inked. Okay, right. My solution to that would, hey, give them 40% of that, and then for each of the 3 years following that the deal actually hits the projected milestones, give them another 20%. But if it doesn't, don't give them anything.
And NPV's net present value. So what they were going to estimate the future cash flow or future revenue from a project.
Right.
So, and you were at Enron for how long?
4+.
4+ years. And is there?
Or as I say, it's like going to being in the Marines in several places. You know, going in the Marine, you can spend a lifetime there in one weekend. You know.
So does that
Camp Pendleton comes to mind.
Right. So the deregulation effort, though, that Enron was part of, is it fair to connect that with the deregulatory efforts in electricity markets in Texas? Was that
and I think all
in that era when electricity is just a commodity. We'll sell watt hours like we sell hamburgers, which miss the importance of electricity as a service. How do you see that?
And actually miss the quality of the hamburgers too, but that's that aside.
I'm sorry, say again.
I miss the quality of the hamburgers also, but the deregulation of the power business had been coming for some time, because in regulated utilities, they own everything from the power plant through the poles and wires to your house, to the transformer, to the meter on the side of your house.
Right.
And so when something went wrong, you call them, say, hey, have the power company. Georgia Power as an example comes to mind, because they're part of the Southern Company they're based in Atlanta. That's Georgia Power. on a couple more utilities. And so to have more power available, there was a demand or a movement to break all that up, break all those pieces up and deregulate that or decouple it. Okay. So the generation was separate. Then you had somebody who manages the poles and the wires. And then there was a distribution group on one end. And then there was it could be an aggregator that was gathering independent customers and managing buying power from various sources, is just moving it on the wires. Okay. So what that did was the intent was to force some efficiency into the power plant for merchant power plants. Because if you can build a power plant, great, go build one. You got a permit, but it's your problem if it's not economically viable.
Right.
As opposed to having that loaded entirely into the tariff for a monopoly utility, so that you had whatever it cost, you just kept having to pay it. And that was partly a product, I think, of the nuke business that went out, because some of the nukes, the big ones up in what was it, Connecticut Yankee, it went 12 years. Tried to get permitted for 12 years, never did. They shut it, never turned it on. There were two, if I recall, those, but like that, but billions of dollars spent and they didn't get anything out of it. And so it put the risk-based folks that are entrepreneurial to figure out how to do this economically and efficiency to build the power plants. And gas is one of the fuels that was available to them to make those power plants operate. So
well, let me jump ahead then. So now we have about a week in looking back at
I can
the
right
Texas
and just
blackouts.
And just like anything,
obvious. The question is obvious now. So
it didn't work. Part of it didn't work. Something didn't work.
Okay, well, and that seems to be the case now, where everybody's looking around saying, "Okay, who's going to get to blame?" And they're musical chairs, and who's going to be left standing here?
Right.
Who deserves? Is there any? Can we only say, "Oh, it was the system? It was the badly constructed market"? What's the way forward now?
Well, one of the ways, back to our insurance side. Okay, there are ways to ensure that there is capacity. Okay. I mean, PJM, there's a quote capacity market, meaning there's availability of power that they hold on reserve, and they pay certain power plants. They may be just sitting there idling, okay, ready to go, but it keeps them where they have that reserve power. Let's see, Pat Wood, who was a former chair of the FERC and also former chair of the Public Utility Commission of Texas, and Julie Parsley, who was former chair of the Public Utility Commission of Texas, also wrote an article, 7.5 years ago, about the need to upgrade the current political policy and operational policy guidelines, change that environment so that policy looks more at not just making power available, but making it reliably available. Now, the R in ERCOT stands for reliability, okay, which has got to be sort of a joke these days, in the last week, but the whole point was ERCOT is not a regulatory board. It is an operating company. Now, it has certain characteristics that look like an operating company and certain that look like a regulatory. So what they do is they dispatch the power. But they ask for the power, ask for the power generators, send it out. We need this. Here's what the balance is. Here's what the load is. But if that power is not available, they can't force somebody to do it. And if if the power company that generates the power doesn't have that capacity, there's no penalty for not being able to. Okay, so there's no financial. You have the opportunity to bid in to sell power into the grid, but there's no penalty for not being able to if you don't. A lot of this can be changed. It's like, well, what happens if it's like buying an insurance car, or like we were talking earlier about, like buying an insurance policy for something that may not happen.
Sure.
Insurance seems really, really expensive. It's like, God, we have to do this right up the time you need it. And it's like, holy cow, that was the smartest decision I made 10 years ago.
Sure.
Well, yeah. Okay. So, it
reminds me of South by Southwest, the big festival here in Austin.
Right.
Right after the pandemic, that started in, the conferences in March, and they had to announce, we're
Started in
canceling.
February. Yeah.
So we're canceling the whole thing. And they looked at their insurance policy and it didn't cover them for pandemic, right?
Right.
They had business interruption of some kind of insurance, but they weren't covered
Right.
for a pandemic. And
Right.
I remember Roland Swinson was quoted saying, yeah, I wish I'd had that in the coverage, right? Because they ended up having to furlough or lay off a whole lot of people for the conference. But so you're saying that because there's been an argument that deregulation didn't help the customer. Let me ask that question. Did deregulation help consumers?
Yeah, deregulation did, because overall, long term, absent driving off this cliff, most of we were doing okay.
No, wait a minute.
Okay.
It was all great.
It's all great right until we rode off this cliff. But
before we went airborne and headed
right.
down.
But the problem was we didn't have a stop sign up there. Okay. Just in front of that cliff. We didn't know. And the point is that there are things you can do to improve the current environment that we're in that don't require. Now, somebody says, if you ask somebody, do you have insurance? Do you have life insurance? Yeah. Why? In case something happens. Well, isn't that expensive? Well, I go, it's worth it. Okay. Well, there's certain things you can do to make sure that the power is available in conditions like these, and we can predict when those conditions are going to be. You look back, had one here in 2021, had one in 2011, had one in 89, had one in 83, had one in 73 before that. I remember the one I was living in Dallas at the time, and the one in 83, got down, I was living in Bedford, got down to 6, count them, 6 degrees. I grew up in the Everglades, 40 degrees above zero is the dead of winter for me. Okay.
Okay. Well, so run me through 3 things. Is weatherizing the equipment? Is that one of them?
Weatherizing. Yeah. Weatherizing.
That's costs get allocated, and that's going to require legislation, right? ERCOT can't just say go do this. They don't have the authority, right? So it's going to require the legislature to do something to cure this.
Yeah. And where I was getting to, if you go back, who's responsible for this? Okay. Right. And when it really gets down to it, and just to put this on entirely in context, I would like to point out there have been 47 deaths here in the Metro Houston and the counties around us. Okay. And I think that's what the number, that's it. That's the latest count. The numbers of the people that died as a consequence of this blackout and the freeze and that sort of thing. And it's a tragedy. And I couldn't be sorrier for those people because it didn't have to happen. Right. The same thing can be said true during the heat waves they go through. Also, the same thing can be said when the hurricanes come through. Okay. We can prepare for hurricanes, but certainly there's going to be some of them that come through. We can't manage all that damage. Okay. It's just going to do certain things. The cold comes through, they tripped off a certain amount of power plants, didn't get back up, but the environment that we were in then was life-threatening. I mean, the climate or the physical environment that we were in was life-threatening, where the heat might have been uncomfortable. It wasn't necessarily life-threatening during a summer event. Okay. Sure. So that's one of the risks. The risk is the probability of occurrence times the consequence if it does. One of the questions that was asked, if I heard it correctly yesterday, was, how often does this occur? It says, well, somebody asked, well, what do you do if this is going to occur again? Well, it doesn't occur that often. And I thought to myself, I didn't ask how often it occurs. I asked, what are you going to do when it does happen? And so that's the buying the insurance part.
And so what are those things? If I was going to make you the chairman of the committee that's going to fix this or make sure this doesn't happen again, because there are a lot of people looking around saying, okay, well, how do we do this?
Well, what are the
top 3 things?
Well, let's now I'll get to that. I don't know if I have 3, but I can tell you a couple anyway.
Okay.
The one thing that's happening right now, because we're in we're in an elevated emotional time because people are angry. If you think they're not angry, you listen to some of the hearings going on in the Capitol. Okay. And the people that are trying to answer the questions over there are trying to give data and information to answer an emotional question. Okay. Now, it's not unreasonable to ask who is responsible. And then the question is, we keep trying to solve the problem. And I'm willing to bet, just having been in problem solving and doing that sort of thing for a long time, the root cause of the problem is not a single root cause. Okay. There were probably 3 or 4 or 5 things. And so before we get into saying what we need to do, we need to define the problem. These days, everybody, if you look at somebody's resume, if you're hiring people, they say, I'm a problem solver. Okay. Everybody says that. What makes you different from everybody else? Okay. Well, magnitude, impact, and in this particular case, problem definition. Because if you can define the problem, then you can solve it. And so right now we're in the post-mortem trying to gather the facts, figure out actually what went wrong. Why did all 185 power plants trip off at one time? Okay. Why did it? And it could have been that there was no VAR support, voltage, amperage, and reactive power support. Put voltage, amperage, reactive power support out in certain locations so it doesn't trip those power plants off. That could be one of them. But in a financial a requirement for if you're going to bid into the system to provide power, then you have to commit to provide that power. Okay, so there's a financial incentive. So if somebody is sitting there on a financial requirement to provide the power, you can't say, well, I'm not going to weatherize in case, they'll make sure they weatherize their plant so that they can do it, can provide the power during a climate event or weather event like this. And so,
if they don't, then they're facing.
Then there's a financial penalty for which they're culpable. Okay, and there are a lot of people say, well, we need a capacity market. Okay, maybe we need to have more capacity to store, more battery capability for storing wind and solar. Yeah, that would help too. Right now, that sort of thing is so expensive that it's hard to do on a grid scale. It's getting easier,
and in particular, last for 6 days.
Right. Because most of the time, what you get is most is a 4-hour shift, so that you can shift sunlight, solar power to about 4 hours after dark to smooth out that production curve.
Right. And that's one of the things that, there's been a lot of talk about, batteries, and we'll do that. But for a situation like this, where batteries don't like cold, the idea that
if you think the wind power had trouble in cold, wait till you see what a battery does.
So you're saying, well, if I'm hearing what you're saying is we need more regulation.
Well, it may be regulation. That's probably true. We need some regulation, and the reason is largely because I recall this is a good 2 decades, maybe 3 ago, just doing some ballparking and talking, because I was working a lot with Georgia Power and a Southern company back at the time, and we were talking about the renewables business is coming online, solar power, and trying to do all this wind, and wind was expensive, and there wasn't much of it. And so they were looking at it's called the system perturbation impacts of wind energy. Okay, so if you've got wind, as the wind comes on, it becomes a larger and larger percentage of the fleet, like we were talking earlier.
Yeah,
the potential impact of that in terms of disrupting the system becomes larger, and as it turns out, it's not a linear progression, it's compounded. So the higher the percentage is, it doesn't get, if you double that percentage, it doesn't get twice as bad, it gets 4 times as bad. So
that volatility in managing the grid, to manage the volatility of the swings in supply and therefore frequency, and the rest becomes more
becomes more important to be able to manage those grid stability components. Okay. Right. Now, one of the things that as an example, PJM does, you have capacity payments up the area of energy payments, and you have to have VAR support, voltage amperage, and reactive power. And it could be just what's called a synchronous condenser. It's just sitting there maintaining the frequency on, it's just running, just spinning. It's not producing any power, it's just keeping the frequency correct.
Right.
Okay. So and that's going to be something that's more important when you get these sudden, it's called a slam, once you get a solar slam where the thing is running at full speed, cloud goes over, it goes to 0, it goes back up to 100, and then comes back down. That sort of slam on the system, the impact on the system is not something that you're going to get out of a thermal plant. And so we're having to build in more capability to respond to things that happen that are unique to the solar or to the renewable side. One of the other things you can do on it is I really do believe that ultimately it'll come down and break down to more microgrids. So rather than managing this like all of Houston, it'll be broken up so there's storage and generation in smaller pieces, and it's particularly useful.
It's interesting you say that, because one of the things that was mentioned on Wednesday, and I think Jackie Sargent from Austin Energy brought it up, was the ability that ERCOT was limited in their ability to implement blackouts. They either had to do, whole sections of Houston or none, because
Right.
and I think, what was implied was that they just simply didn't have the switching capability to do.
Well, they didn't have
blackout.
that. They didn't have the granularity in the decision making. Okay, where you could take it out like a neighborhood or something like that,
or physical switching that would allow them to do it. Is that
well?
fair?
And that's the point. I mean, that's the granularity. They didn't have it down where there were cutoffs that for each. They needed more switches where it broke the thing up into smaller zones. As an example, when let me think, the county judge for Galveston County. Okay, Mark. I'll think of it in a second, but I'm sorry, I can't remember right now because I just mentioned it. But anyway, all of Galveston County went out. Okay. Well, I mean, it's like, okay, is that fair? I don't know. And it may not have been, a decision that was based on fair. It was something that had to be done based on whatever power plant maybe had been down there that tripped off, that they only had one switch they could unload that zone.
Right.
Okay. So to shed that load. So having this with more optionality in the capacity to shed this load could add it could have changed a lot of things last week.
Sure. Okay. So what I've
heard, but in the end, they couldn't get the power back up, and it was off. Once it was off, there were too many things that were still freezing and going immobile and not able to come back up.
So what I've heard you say, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong. If I was going to put you in charge of this, you're going to require that that generators have more resilience overall, that allows them to dispatch more with more confidence that they will dispatch. So
I mean, there's several
capacity market. You're talking about regulatory skein that is going to. I guess I'm just talking about basic resilience.
Well, here's an example. And it's exactly what you say. It's the resilience. Okay, so since they're bidding into an energy market. Okay, when they need the power, they bid them in terms of the cost. Okay, so the lowest cost energy goes onto the market first. Okay, so if you add weatherization into your cost, to weatherize your plant every year, that raises your cost slightly. Right. Okay, so that would put you behind somebody who's bidding ahead of you. So, but rather than having a capacity market, which is for you to stand by, what you could do is have, as an example, require the weatherization, because FERC had guidelines of weatherization. NERC had guidelines for North American Electric Reliability Corporation. Those will eventually come out with rules that all the power plants will have to meet the NERC rules on weatherization for things like this. And what's happening is, if you look at the full spectrum end to end of the possibility, the context that power plants are operating. So from really, 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 really cold to really, 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 really hot. Okay. Texas has about as wide a spread on that as you can get, because it was -2 and it was -2 in Dallas. It got like 12 or 15 below zero. And the hottest temperature recorded in Dallas was 113. Okay. So if you take a 100-degree swing on that, what's happening is the point along that, if you take 100% of that, and there's 5% on each end where it's difficult to operate. Okay. But everything else, the middle 90%, it functions fine. Okay. Because of some of these other quote perturbations that come in and these forceful weather events. Okay. Harsh weather events. That area, that zone within which it operates optimally is getting narrower, is shortening. And there's more of a piece out on each end because of just the way the system is now. I'm not trying to not blame it on wind, not blame it on solar, not blame it on gas, none of it. Okay. It's just that it's a more complex system now that has to be managed more individually at these extreme weather events. And so
what is that going to do to prices?
It will, what it would do is it would raise prices slightly, and you can manage that price. Pat Wood was saying that there was, there's a way you could do that financially so that it has a minimal impact on the day-to-day retail user. There are ways to do this. So you can put the prices, you can load the prices on the larger users. You can load, so the ones that use like a small residential meter, they don't have to pay so much of that. But yeah, it's going to go up. Otherwise, you're willing to pay the price for running the risk of it going out.
Well, and that's one of the things that to me is amazing.
That's
Is
the
amazing
trade-off.
is that we're hearing, we've heard over and over the wind and solar are cheaper. Well, okay, but maybe they're only cheaper until they're not.
Well, and when what you're looking at is the production is cheaper, but the reliability is not. If you're buying reliability, the production is cheaper, but if you're buying the reliability, the coal and the gas are cheaper.
Well, so let's talk about gas, because there's been a lot of talk about that, and I have my bias on it. There was a lot of talk about gas being unavailable, freeze offs, et cetera. But when I look at the graphs on what actually came into the market, and particularly during crunch time, I saw
Gas was cooking.
it was natural gas, and gas was dispatching, and that in my estimation, gas saved the day. Am I wrong?
I think that's absolutely correct. And
so why don't we hear that?
Well, there's a political media component dimension to all of this that your listeners are free to consider at their own pace, but I just think that there's having a background in engineering, numerics, finance, this kind of stuff. I can take a really cold-hearted look at this. Okay.
Well, then bring it.
Well, and it's off-putting to some people who say, well, we've got to get this because the climate's okay. I got that. But if you're not going to use gas, you can't use renewables to get to where we need to go for climate change. You can't use only renewables. Renewables will be there, but eventually, it's going to take all of these working together. Okay. When all of these go down.
Can I stop you? Am I hearing you say that we can't use renewables at scale without natural gas?
Absolutely correct.
So that is, but therein seems to me to be the problem, right? That and we've invested a lot. I mean, there are different numbers about how much spending has gone to renewables in Texas, and estimates, and I've seen anywhere from $30 to $60 billion. Is that malinvestment though? Are we spending the money on the wrong things? And shouldn't, Austin was thinking about building a couple of new nuclear reactors. Is it fair to characterize all of that spending on renewables as not being the best for the consumer because we couldn't rely on them when the chips were really down and the grid was on the verge of collapse?
Well, if you're buying reliability, that has a component of the answer. Yeah, if the reliability is critical. Think for a second on like this, okay? Imagine you're the Baytown East Freeway. You go out there to the Chevron Texaco Baytown refinery, okay? And you go in the styrene line, okay? Styrene's a plastic, precursor to plastic. Make beads. Okay, it's basically little tiny plastic beads, but it's this glop that goes to these things. Okay,
used for bottles and packaging.
It's everything. Okay, yeah. And so now, if you're going out there and the power goes down, okay, let's just imagine that you're in. Like I was looking at a project in down the Ship Channel some years ago. There was this particular location, and it was transmission congested because the wires are only so big and they could only push so much power down there, and so they built their own power plant just for this styrene line, because if that styrene line goes down and it's not what they call cold stopped, if it's hot stopped, meaning it's running and then you just turn the power off, you got 6 hours that you have to get that moved out of there. Otherwise, you spend the next 6 weeks chipping all that plastic out of the process components because it's solidified and all that. Now, what's the risk of the power failure in that location? I don't know, but I ain't paying for 6 weeks worth of lost production, like 6 weeks of it. To me, it would be worth having the small power plant there just to make sure that didn't happen. Right. Okay. So that's insurance. That's just the insurance against that. Okay. So the question is, if we see, or if we think, or the guess is, or if the risk in terms of the probability of occurrence times the nature of the consequences of the event, like we just had, is such that we don't want to ever go through that again. We don't want to ever go through that again. Okay. What are you willing to pay to keep that from happening?
And it's going to be something more than what we're paying now.
Correct.
And that ultimately, you're saying it might not fall to the consumer, but I also heard during the ERCOT call that any of these companies that default, that go bankrupt and can't pay their bills, all of those costs are going to be socialized among all of the ERCOT members. So
Right.
it sure looks to me like that a lot of these costs are going to be socialized, which, I joke about.
Yeah,
it,
if they
but,
default, if they
privatize the profits and socialize the costs, right? That's the way.
yeah, and that's and it could be, the policy is that as developed in it. I'm really good at engineering, okay, but I'm a student of economics and history, and I'm trying to find any policy, economic and financial policy that you can put in place and have it last forever. Okay, every so often you need to have a course correction on that, change the policy, improve it to represent the conditions that exist as we see them and as we expect them to be. And then in so many more years, take another look at it. I think that's what Pat and Julie were looking at in the paper they did, or an article they wrote 7.5 years ago about, okay, it's time for a policy review on this to see if we're taking into account, because now we've got other things that have come into the play, okay, into the mix to be able for that policy has to be adapted to meet the current context.
Sure. Well, so last thing, we've been talking for about an hour here, and I've just been looking at the numbers potentially in terms of the overall costs of this debacle. We're only a week past it, right? But I think the numbers that I've seen, the estimates are that the amount of revenue that was expected, or because of the electricity consumed last week alone, was on the order of $50 billion. Well, in 2020, total electricity sales in Texas for the year in 2020 were 35 billion. So in a week, we had electricity sales that, in theory anyway, were 1.5 times our total annual consumption.
To me, that just says there's a mismatch in the equation, in the how we calculate all those. Okay, there's and that's back to my original point about quantifying the problem. We've got to figure out what the problem exactly is. Yes, they've estimated those. Do we have any numbers to back that up? I don't know. Do we? Those are estimates,
and I can't answer that. But to me,
well, nobody. And the point is, nobody can right now. And there are a lot of people that are out there just working like rascals to try to figure this out and gather the data to be able to quantify the problem. Because the last thing you want to do is solve a problem that's not the right one.
Sure, but it seems to me the problem overall in the market structure, and this is what I want to ask, is that the system was designed to reward crisis and high prices and not to reward stability and low prices. And for something that's as critical as electricity, it just seems like a fundamental flaw in the way the market was set up, and demands that the market be rejiggered for not for crisis, but for stability and reliability.
And what you're probably referring to is the $9,000 per megawatt hour cap on the, okay. Yeah. Then like the one before that was 4,500, and I think it was 2,000 before then, and 1,000 that kept getting jacked up. Okay.
Right.
And the intent was because there was a continuously escalating or projectable demand or increase in the demand for power. Okay. Right. In Texas. Right. And so the folks that would be building those kind of things would say, well, we don't have any capacity markets. We have no way to figure out how we're going to do this. If we build a Mercer plant, we'll base it on what, 16 hours, 18 hours in the summer where you get $9,000 a megawatt hour. Can't do that for you can't build a new nuke plant on that without having unless you've got a really large balance sheet, and you can do it on your own. And so the intent, while it turns out it looked like just what you said, the intent of that was to continue to raise that amount to be able to provide an incentive for folks to build power.
Sure.
And the disconnect in my mind, and this is my perspective, okay, they kept trying to get people to build power by changing the energy price, and they're two different things.
Right. Well, that's a great point. So just build that out a little bit, and then we'll quit. But that seemed to me that and even implied on Wednesday in the urgent board meeting with ERCOT that Bill Magnus implied, well, even at $9,000, there were people that just couldn't get. There was just no way that you could have paid $1 billion and they couldn't get you in the
okay, imagine you've got a 500 megawatt gas fired plant that, because of the early cold and what was going on, trips off. Okay. Now you got a frozen valve, not enough gas in there. You see the price going up. Do you really think that any self-respecting power provider, okay, is going to sit there and by choice be out of the market when the price hits $9,000 a megawatt hour?
Well, no, I mean, they'd want to be
Exactly. They want to be in it.
But but the question is, would they be able to even have the power plant in the, because I've also heard that the way the market was structured, there just weren't enough people that were willing to take such a big bet that they're going to be those few hours a year when they can run and make their capital.
Well, and that's
back.
the point. But if you have the power plant and you're there and it tripped off last week and you're fighting to get back in and the price goes up, what that price represents is the short-term demand on it's like the price or the supply and the demand curve changing and running that price up to the point that they were trying to get everybody who could to get more. But
Sure.
if you've got something there that if you have let's say you've got a 500 megawatt power plant, gas fired power plant that's going to cost you $500 million a megawatt is not unreasonable. Okay. Just as a round number. Okay. Yeah. So if you put that out there, unless it's a merchant plant where there's a high probability you got constant demand on it and you don't have capacity payments, which means that you're providing the power. Okay. You can't get you can't get financing for it unless you've got a reliable amount of revenue coming into it, of offtake, which provides you the revenue. That's why nuclear plants, which as you and I have talked on a number of occasions, totally clean, in terms of emissions, the smaller footprint, they got modular plants. I have to say one of the things that the French did particularly well was get their nuclear electric production regulation down to a science. Okay. If I recall correctly, they have a standard design of 600 megawatts for nuclear. If you need 500 megawatts, good. You're going to build a 600. Well, we only need 300. Good. It's your problem. Figure out what to do with the other 300. Well, we need 900. Then you're going to build 2 6s. Okay. Because they know how to do it and know what the risk is and how to build them. And they're cookie cutters now. They just plant those.
Right.
Practically every one of the nuke plants in the U.S. was a one-off.
Sure.
Okay, so they're practically impossible to permit. Where I was going with that is, unless you have the capacity to finance out on your own balance sheet, you can't get project financing for it because you don't have reliable offtake
for the gas-fired power plant that's going to be able to meet that 9,000 or whatever it is to meet that,
right?
To potentially play in the casino where you could maybe get the jackpot, right?
Right. So and then if you've got 3 days in the summer where you're running $9,000 a megawatt hour. Now let's face it, that's $2.25 or $225,000 more or less, every day.
Right.
Day after day.
So the bottom line is here that the system is going to have to change, and it's going to have to be skewed toward reliability, resilience efforts that are ultimately are going to be required. There's just not going to be any elective anymore. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it is. And I think the reason is because we now know that reliability has value.
And with that, and the lack of the reliability has a high cost.
It's high cost, right? And so your cost benefit to cost ratio, if you look at that, in my estimation, it's one of the reasons in my house, we have certain things that we put in here, it's like, well, that just adds the cost per square foot. Yep, you're absolutely right. It does. No question about it. But also, I sleep pretty well at night too.
Right. Gotcha. Well, let's stop on that note, J. Paul. You've been very kind with your time. We've talked for about an hour. Folks out there, J. Paul Oxer is a independent power developer. He has over 40 years of experience in this business, so he knows a little bit about what he's talking about. He's been a good friend of mine for a long time, and I hope you've enjoyed what he had to say. J. Paul, thanks for coming on the Power Hungry podcast. I'm sure I've enjoyed it.
Thanks so much, Robert. See you in Austin.
And to all you in podcast land, thanks for tuning in. We might have yet another guest on the Power Hungry podcast in Blackout Week, which I'm not celebrating, but this has been a key event in Texas, and I was blacked out for 45 hours. So I don't like it. I'm adamantly opposed to blackouts. But we'll be talking about these issues on the Power Hungry podcast for a long time to come, and hopefully have guests like J. Paul to help explain it. So thanks again, J. Paul. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. Tune in next time for the Power Hungry podcast.